Today, we're going to break down one of history's most fascinating chain reactions. We're talking about how a series of arguments, some new taxes, and a whole lot of protests between Great Britain and its American colonies spiraled into a full-blown war for independence. So yeah, let's just dive right in.
It really all comes down to this one question, right? How does a simple disagreement get so out of hand? Well, it never happens overnight. Instead, what you see is a series of steps. And with each step, the stakes get higher, pushing both sides further and further apart until, eventually, there's just no turning back.
And our story, well, it actually begins somewhere you might not expect. Not with a tax, not with a protest, but with a war. A war that Britain actually won, but a victory that would, believe it or not, end up costing them an entire empire.
So let's talk about the French and Indian War, which finally wrapped up in 1763. Now, this was a massive global conflict. And when the dust settled, Great Britain was the undisputed champ in North America. But, and this is a huge but, that victory came at a staggering price. The British government was suddenly buried under a mountain of debt.
And this right here, this is the heart of the whole issue. Britain's main motivation for everything that's about to happen wasn't some grand plan for tyranny, at least not at first. It was just simple economics. They had a massive bill to pay for a war that was fought in large part to protect the American colonies.
Now, if you're sitting in Parliament, this probably seems perfectly fair. You know, the colonies are enjoying the safety and security of the British Empire, so of course they should chip in for the cost. But if you were a colonist who had just fought and maybe even lost family in that same war, this felt like a total betrayal. They felt like they'd already paid their fair share in blood.
And then, to make things even worse, Britain basically drew a line on the map. The Proclamation of 1763 said, nope, you can't expand westward into the very lands you just helped us win. For Britain, this was just a practical way to avoid more costly wars with Native American tribes. But for the colonists, it was a massive slap in the face. It crushed their dreams of getting new land and having new opportunities.
So you've got this mix of huge debt and broken promises just simmering, and that sets the stage perfectly for the next and probably most famous phase of this whole conflict, a relentless series of new taxes that would ignite an absolute firestorm of protest.
The really incredible thing to notice here is just the speed. Look how fast these taxes came down the pike. 1764, 65, 67, boom, boom, boom. The Sugar Act, the Stamp Act, the Townshend Acts. All of a sudden, everything from your morning sugar to legal documents, newspapers, playing cards, even paint and glass and tea was being taxed by a government thousands of miles away.
But here's the absolute key to understanding this whole thing. For the colonists, their anger wasn't really about paying a few extra pennies here and there. It was about something much bigger, a fundamental right they believed they had as citizens of the British Empire. And this, right here, became their rallying cry. No taxation without representation. The logic behind it was just so simple. How can a government 3,000 miles away, a government where we have no elected officials to speak for us, have the right to just take our money? To them, it wasn't a tax. It was theft, plain and simple.
So what did they do? Well, they started to get organized. They boycotted British goods, which was a pretty brilliant move that hit British merchants right where it hurts, in the wallet. They took to the streets to protest, and powerful groups like the Sons of Liberty started popping up to turn all that scattered anger into a real, coordinated movement.
And, as you can probably guess, with tensions rising this high, it was only a matter of time before angry words and economic protests turned into actual physical violence. This argument was about to draw blood.
The flashpoint was Boston. The city was just simmering with resentment. You had thousands of British soldiers, the Redcoats, stationed there to enforce all these new laws. And to the locals, they weren't protectors. They felt like an occupying army.
So on a cold night in March, a confrontation on the street just blew up. Colonists started throwing snowballs, rocks, and whatever else they could find at a squad of British soldiers. The soldiers, probably panicked and feeling surrounded, opened fire. And when the smoke cleared, 5 colonists were dead on the street.
This event was immediately named the Boston Massacre, and this is a perfect example of the power of a good story. Paul Revere made this famous engraving of the event, and it wasn't exactly accurate. It showed organized soldiers firing on a totally peaceful, unarmed crowd. But as a piece of propaganda, it was incredibly powerful, and it spread like wildfire across the colonies as absolute proof of British tyranny.
After things calmed down a little bit after the massacre, the whole conflict reignited over the most British thing imaginable: tea.
But this time, the colonists were ready to move way beyond protests. They were about to commit a massive and very public act of defiance.
So in 1773, Britain passed the Tea Act. Now, the official goal was to bail out the struggling British East India Company by giving it a total monopoly on tea sales in the colonies. But the act also kept that hated tax on tea, and it was designed to undercut the local colonial merchants. The colonists saw it as just another trick, another sneaky attempt to force them to admit that Parliament had the right to tax them.
And so on the night of December 16th, the Sons of Liberty decided to take matters into their own hands. They disguised themselves as Native Americans, boarded 3 ships sitting in Boston Harbor, and destroyed a fortune in private property, dumping 342 massive chests of tea right into the sea. This wasn't just some random riot. It was a carefully planned, symbolic act of political protest.
The Boston Tea Party was a direct challenge to British authority, and there was no way they were going to let it slide. Britain's response would be the final shove, the one that pushed the colonies right over the edge and onto the path to war.
You can see the whole dynamic of the revolution perfectly right here. It's all action and reaction. The colonists staged this big protest, the Tea Party, and Britain's response isn't negotiation or compromise. Nope, it's overwhelming force designed to punish Massachusetts and make an example out of it for everyone else.
And let me tell you, the colonists called them the intolerable acts for a very good reason. Closing Boston Harbor? That was basically an economic death sentence for the city. Taking away their local government's power? That stripped them of their political voice. And maybe most offensive of all, the Quartering Act forced regular citizens to house British soldiers in their own homes. This wasn't just about lawmaking anymore. This felt like a direct assault on their freedom. But here's where Britain made a colossal, history-changing miscalculation. They thought that by punishing Boston so harshly, they would scare the other colonies into line. Well, it did the exact opposite. The other colonies looked at what was happening in Massachusetts and thought, that could be us next. And suddenly, food and supplies started pouring into Boston from all over America. A shared sense of identity was being forged in the fire of this punishment.
So what this all adds up to is a relationship that is just shattered beyond any hope of repair. From the debt of a war, to taxes, to protests, to violence, and finally to this crushing punishment. Every single step had pushed the two sides further apart. By now, the colonies were armed, local militias were training, and everyone could feel that something huge was about to happen.
The argument had finally run its course. The time for writing petitions and boycotting goods was clearly over. The only question left hanging in the air was, what single event would finally be the spark that ignites this powder keg and officially starts the American Revolution?